Hello, you're watching the Daily Roundup by People's Dispatch, where we bring you some of the top stories from around the world. Let's take a look at the headlines. Illegal US blockade of Cuba denounced at UN, massive demonstrations in Spain over low wages, 4 Palestinians, including teenager, killed in fresh Israel violence, rights group urge FIFA, Qatar to compensate migrant workers. The UN General Assembly on November 3, Thursday, once again voted almost unanimously for the United States to lift the cruel 60-year blockade against Cuba. 185 countries voted in favor of the resolution to lift the blockade. Brazil and Ukraine abstained while the United States and Israel voted against the resolution. The US has waged a war of attrition against Cuba since the nation's socialist revolution overthrew a US-backed dictator. The blockade is the patchwork of economic, commercial, and financial policies that above all seeks to make foreign trade with Cuba impossible and hinders the delivery of humanitarian aid. Speaking at the UNGA, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez said that more than 80% of the current Cuban population was born under the blockade. He noted that 3 decades have passed since this assembly has been demanding the revocation of the US policy every year. He added that the policy has been classified as an act of genocide, which has the effect of a permanent pandemic of a constant hurricane and is universally rejected. Rodriguez, while presenting the Cuban government's report on losses incurred by the country because of the US blockade to the UN, termed it as an act of economic warfare, designed to result in the collapse of the Cuban economy. By the calculations of the Foreign Ministry, the blockade deprives the Cuban people of 15 million US dollars per day. Since the beginning of the blockade in 1962, the Cuban people have lost as much as 1.391 trillion US dollars to the blockade. While rejection of the blockade has grown, US measures against Cuba have only increased. President Biden has continued to implement the worst of the 243 new sanctions that former President Donald Trump imposed. Rodriguez explained how in the first 7 months of 2022, these sanctions have cost the Cuban people 3.8 billion US dollars. Furthermore, Biden has stayed faithful to Trump's policy of voting against the blockade in the UN in 2016. Under President Barack Obama, the US abstained from the vote. Additionally, Cuba continues to be on the US state sponsors of terrorism list, a policy which many US activists staunchly oppose. More than 45,000 workers belonging to a number of trade unions on November 3, Thursday, staged massive demonstrations in the Spanish capital, Madrid. They demanded an increase in wages on par with the soaring inflation. The demonstrations were called by the unions, the Workers' Commission's CCOO, and the General Union of Workers UGT. The demonstrations were seen carrying posters and banners stating their demands, besides raising slogans against the companies and other employers for refusing to increase salaries while generating massive profits at the time of record inflation. The Communist Party of Spain and the Communist Youth Union of Spain members were seen participating in the demonstrations. They expressed their support and solidarity with the workers. Workers, along with ordinary people across Spain, have been facing an acute cost of living crisis marked by soaring prices of food and fuel. Workers have been demanding a wage hike in the range of 3.5 to 4.5%, up from their demand from about 6 months ago of 3.5% increase owing to the latest even higher inflation levels. The rate of inflation in the month of September stood at 8.9%. Talks between the union representing the workers and employers had reportedly been going on for more than 5 months before the talks were suspended over the disagreements over the wage hike. The country's employers have so far refused to increase workers' wages in line with their demands, with government statistics noting that in the agreement signed so far between the workers and employers across various sectors and industries in the country, the average salary increase has not been more than 2.6%. As a result, the trade unions in Spain have alleged that the employers and their organizations are making a reckless and suicidal bet on the devaluation and wage freezes. The parties in the incumbent government coalition, the PCE and the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, noted that the government has in fact raised pensions, social benefits, and salaries of employees and civil servants, but it has been the employers in the private sector who continue to block and oppose collective bargaining and rising of the workers' wages. Moving on to our third story, Four Palestinians were killed by Israeli security forces on Thursday, November 3, in multiple incidents of violence in occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Among the dead were three Palestinian men and one teenager. One Palestinian, identified as a 42-year-old Daoud Rayan, was killed by Israeli forces in the village of Beit Duku. He was killed during clashes that broke out between the security forces and village residents protesting the ongoing raid on their village. Israel forces were raiding the village to conduct the search of a family home of another Palestinian man, 54-year-old Habis Rayan. They had shot him dead a day earlier, allegedly during a car ramming attack, which they claimed injured one Israeli soldier. Another Palestinian, identified as 20-year-old Amr Halabia, was shot dead during an alleged stabbing attempt in the old city of Jerusalem. Reports said that three Israeli police officers were wounded during the incident, with one of them suffering from gunshot wounds, most likely from the police's own firing. Later in the day, Israeli forces killed 28-year-old Farouk Jamil Salameh and 14-year-old Mohammad Samer Khalouf. Palestinian sources said that Salameh was a member of the Jenin Battalion, armed group of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement. Palestinian sources said that Salameh was a member of the Jenin Battalion armed group of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement. The Israeli army said that it conducted the raid to target Salameh. It alleged that Salameh was responsible for the killing of an Israeli soldier in May this year. With the four killings yesterday, the number of Palestinians killed by Israeli security forces and settlers this year has risen to 135, among them more than 29 children. The United Nations recently said that 2022 has been the deadliest year for Palestinians on a monthly average in the West Bank since 2005. The killings additionally came on the same day when Israel lifted its extended siege on the town of Nablus in the West Bank. It had laid siege on the town beginning last month after the alleged killing of an Israeli soldier near an illegal Israeli settlement. The brutal and repressive siege was accompanied by a massive violent manhunt by the Israeli forces for the suspected assailant in the soldier's killing. And finally, international human rights groups such as the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International on Wednesday, November 2, condemned the Qatari Labour Minister's refusal to create a remedy fund for migrant workers who endured mistreatment, abuse and harm while in the country for Football World Cup related construction projects. They called on Qatar to deliver on its promises of labour reforms in the country, not just in relation to the World Cup, but strengthening and improving of labour rights and conditions even for the future. The rights group did not acknowledge that Qatar has made significant improvements in terms of labour rights and protections since widespread international criticism and outrage over the thousands of migrant workers' deaths, suicides, and other issues affecting 2 million or so migrant workers in the country, most of them from countries in South Asia such as India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Nepal. Amnesty, in its statement regarding the matter, noted that in spite of the improvements made by the Qatari government since 2017, many workers are still suffering from issues such as delayed or unpaid wages, forced labor, denial of rest days, unsafe working conditions, barriers to changing jobs, and limited access to justice, among others. It further highlighted the lack of proper investigations, accountability, and compensation for the thousands of workers' deaths that have occurred in the country over the last decade or so. It noted that these deaths continue to be unexplained, which further adds to the emotional agony and trauma for the families and loved ones of the deceased workers back home in their native countries. The rights group additionally urged FIFA, World Football's governing body, to act on fulfilling its responsibilities towards the migrant workers irrespective of Qatar's responses. They reminded FIFA that its own officials had in a meeting on labour rights last month expressed interest in setting up a compensation mechanism. Furthermore, numerous football associations, sponsors, world leaders, and the fans all over the world have extended their support to the workers and appealed to the authorities to provide appropriate compensation to workers and their families. And that's all for today's episode. For more such stories, visit our website peoplesdispatch.org and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.